우리가 조직 생활을 하거나 사회 생활을 하다 보면은 그 조직 안에 있는 모든 사람들이 야 이건 아니지 라고 생각을 하고 있는데도 막상 진짜 중요한 자리에 가면은 아무도 발언을 안 하고 아무도 손을 안 드는 경우를 굉장히 많이 경험을 할 겁니다. 만약에 그런 경우가 됐을 때 마치 내가 손을 들면 나만 총대를 매게 되는 것 같아서 나도 발언을 안 하게 되고 이럴 때마다 속으로 답답한 기분이 들 거예요. 아니 왜? 할 말을 못 할까? 왜 그런지를 명쾌하게 설명해주는 책이 있어서 오늘 소개해드리려고 하는데, 하버드 대학 교수 토드 로즈가 쓴 이 컬렉티브 일루션, 집단 착각이라는 책이에요. 이 책에 보면 이제 미시적으로는 우리 동네 또는 학교 같은 데서 일어나는 부조리, 뭐 예를 들어서 학교 폭력 같은 거를 보고도 왜 반에 있는 친구들이 아무도 힘을 합쳐서 학폭을 하는 친구를 막지 않는지 같은 문제부터 더 크게는 독재자라든지 아니면 종교적 극단주의자 이런 사람들이 사실은 소수의 지지만을 가지고 있는데도 어떻게 그렇게 많은 사람들에게 권력을 행사할 수 있는지, 이런 것들이 우리가 남들의 눈치를 보고 말을 못하게 하는 어떤 우리 머릿속에 있는 심리적 메커니즘 때문에 그렇다라는 얘기를 합니다. 그리고 이 메커니즘을 토드 로즈가 Collective Illusion, 집단 착각이라고 불러요. 토드 로즈 교수의 목소리로 직접 집단 착각이 무엇인지, 그리고 이 집단 착각이 우리한테 어떤 영향을 미치고 이걸 이겨내려면 어떻게 해야 되는지 한번 들어보겠습니다. So what is collective illusion and how does this mechanism work?
So basically, collective illusions are like social phenomenon where entire groups of people go along with things that they don't privately agree with just because they incorrectly think most people in the group agree with it, right? So as a result, like the entire group ends up doing something that almost no one wants to do. Every human being on the planet has a conformity bias, meaning that all else equal, we'd rather be with our group rather than go against the group. We're a pack species as humans. You know, we're not really meant to survive on our own. Throughout history, being outside the group was actually dangerous for you. So it's not surprising we're very sensitive to that. But the problem is, to conform, you have to know what the group actually thinks. Otherwise, what are you conforming to? And so here's where we get into trouble. You would think for how important conformity is, your brain would be really sophisticated in determining what the group thinks, but it's not. It's no kidding. Your brain assumes the loudest voices repeated the most are the majority. Like, you know, have you ever been like on social media, on YouTube, whatever, and like you could end up having a bunch of negative comments and it feels like everybody hates you, right? And it's like,
Right. And you realize that maybe like 0.1% of people who are watching your content is actually commenting, but it's really hard to get those dozen voices out of your head.
And it feels like they represent more people than they really do. Let's just think about like what was previously Twitter, right? X now. In the US alone, 80% of all content on that platform is created by only 10% of the users. So you can see the problem, right? Like if 10% of people believe something, but you think it's 80%, then you're going to think that's the majority. And unless you're willing to go against the group, you're going to just self-silence. You're going to say nothing, or you might lie to be with the group. And then pretty soon, the only voices anybody's hearing are from that fringe, right? That 10%. And then the result's an illusion. I think that collective illusions and the ability to create them because of social media platforms are a modern form of psychological warfare now. That bad actors, other countries, can actually systematically manipulate the consensus in our own countries on a whole range of topics by using social bots or even manipulating algorithms. And so it's just, we've got to be aware of this as a people, that we can no longer trust our brains to tell us what our groups really think. And every time we conform to what we think everybody wants, we very well may be just falling for the illusion and actually making it a self-fulfilling prophecy.
What you said about both is quite revealing, because you said the loudest voice that repeats often will often be taken by people as truth. We were wired that way. But if you think about it, I mean, bots are not people, so they don't abide by usual rules of politeness. Like a lot of human beings will not affirm their opinion that strongly because, you know, they're people and they care about other people's feelings, and bots don't. So they will affirm an opinion really strongly. So they'll be the loudest voice in the room, and they can repeat a million times a minute if they are told to do so. So like you're saying, the loudest voice that you're repeating the most often, usually in 21st century, won't even be a human being. It'll be like bots released by some bad guy.
Exactly. The research suggests that on social media, if only 5% of the accounts interacting on a topic are bots and they're designed the right way, they can single-handedly determine group consensus on the issue. You only need 5% of your interactions for that. Most research suggests that a typical person around the world on one of the major social media platforms will about somewhere between 10 and 20% of all your interactions are actually with bots and you don't know it. You can't behave as though this is actually what the group thinks because you don't really know that anymore.
우리는 다수의 의견을 따르는 동물이고 그런데 다수의 의견이 뭔지를 알아차리는데 굉장히 둔하기 때문에 가장 자주 들리는 의견이 다수의 의견이라고 착각을 한다라는 내용이었는데 이게 이제 인터넷과 결합이 되면서 어떤 무서운 상황이 연출되냐면은 예를 들어서 95%의 사람들은 가만히 있는데 아무 말도 안 하고 있어요. 근데 5%의 사람들이 인터넷에서 도배를 하기 시작하잖아요. 그럼 대부분의 사람들은 그 5%의 의견이 주류 의견이라고 생각을 하고 거기에 대한 반대 의견 내기를 굉장히 무서워한대요. 그래서 테크놀로지와 이 집단 착각이라는 우리의 본성이 만나면 한 300명이나 400명이 열심히 댓글만 치더라도 대부분의 사람들한테 겁을 줘서 자기의 의견을 말하지 못하게 하기가 굉장히 쉽다라는 얘기도 무서운 내용 중에 하나였습니다. 우리가 알고 있는 굉장히 유명한 집단 착각에 대한 이야기가 있어요. 이 책에도 많이 인용되는 벌거벗은 임금님에 대한 얘기죠. 황제가 새로운 옷을 샀다고 하는데 사실은 옷이 없죠. 그래서 황제가 벌거벗고 있는데 주변에 있는 신하들이나 모든 사람들한테 야, 내 새 옷 어때? 라고 하니까 혹시 황제한테 혼날까봐 새 옷 멋있습니다 라고 얘기를 해주고 또 신하들이 그러니까 다른 백성들도 야, 황제의 새 옷 너무 멋있다 라고 얘기를 하다 보니까 황제가 벌거벗은 모습을 뻔히 보고 있는 사람도 아니 내가 잘못했나? 라고 생각을 하면서 황제가 벌거벗고 있다는 진실을 아무도 얘기하지 못하게 된 그런 상황이 집단 착각을 한 번에 보여주는 그 이야기다라고 얘기를 합니다. To help the understanding, let's take an example from my childhood. We had at our school some serious like school bullying problem. And in my school, how it happened was usually the bully was the most aggressive acting and the loudest kid in the school. And what this kid would do is he would have crony of like 2 or 3 acolytes and he would barge into like a random classroom and start picking on the most introverted person in the room. And the introverted kid was often physically like bigger than the bully.
Wow.
Right? The situation you're describing, 20, 30 kids in the room that probably all didn't like what was going on, but they said nothing, right? And if somebody tried to stand up and say something, usually the person next to you will say like, shh, sit down. Right, you're going to attract the bully to our side, and then, our life is going to be hell.
There's a pretty famous phenomenon called the bystander effect, right? Which is we sit there and we look around and we see something happening and we don't like it, and then nobody says anything. And to your first point, which I think is really important, whether it's a bully or a boss, you'd be surprised the number of times the second you stand up to it, they back down. No one ever tested whether this kid was actually tough, right? And my guess is probably not. Right? Because really tough people don't usually have to barge into a room and puff up and act big, right? They know they're strong.
If you think about all the teen movies in the late 90s and early 2000s, they always end with a nerdy kid who used to be the victim of bullying, finally gets up the courage to say something. And usually it's like some pool party where all the cool kids go to. And this guy finally like gets up somewhere and makes like a big speech and everybody claps. The bully is ostracized. Happy ending, right? Like if a nerdy kid actually stood up, in class on top of a desk and started saying the same thing that the movie character said, he would probably be labeled as the biggest loser in school and his life would be more miserable than before he made the speech. Like nobody would clap. So why is there such a discrepancy between what we cheer for when it's fictional and when it's ideal and what we actually do in real life?
And I talked about it in the book a little bit, like we actually have a built-in desire to be honest with other people about our views. We actually get a little bit of a dopamine reward response when we express our honest opinions. Speaks to our ongoing desire to be authentic, which is great, right? Because it means that if we think about how we structure societies and the norms that we create, we have a chance to get to a place where this is what it means to be part of society. It doesn't mean being a jerk, but it does mean being honest with each other. So that still gives me hope. Now, of course, as you said, there's a big discrepancy between that and real life, which just suggests we got a lot of work to do.
근데 이런 얘기를 읽으면서 제가 궁금했던 게 있어요. 특히 2차 세계대전 때 스탈린이라든지 아니면 히틀러 같은 독재자들이 오픈카를 타고 퍼레이드를 하는 장면을 볼 수가 있어요. 그럼 그 양쪽에 이제 수많은 국민들이 쫙 서 있는데 그 사람 중에서 내가 전쟁에 끌려가기 싫은 사람 아니면 가족이 죽임을 당했던 사람이 얼마나 많았겠어요. 야, 너가 뭔데? 하고 갑자기 한꺼번에 달겨 들어가지고 그 사람을 그냥 끌어냈으면 그 자리에서 이 2차 세계대전이라는 끔찍한 인류의 악몽이 끝나지 않았을까? 근데 왜 아무도 그렇지 못했을까라는 생각을 했습니다. As you say in your book, if the collective illusion is something that's just so primal, so powerful, and so ingrained in human nature, what happens at those few glorious moments in human history when people say, okay, no more? Like now I feel somehow entitled or empowered to storm the Bastille or say to the Duce, like, no, you're a dictator, you're not going to run Italy anymore. Like what happens at that particular point?
Do you remember in Les Mis, there's a scene where they're so convinced that everybody will come if they create that barricade in the movie version, right? And they're gonna like, if we just do it, all the people will come out and they will fight and we'll be free. And they don't come out. Right. So that's the risk, right? So right now you're thinking, how do I know what people really think? Because I don't have any access to their private thoughts. So I can only look at their behavior. And right now, everybody else is sitting in the crowd like I am. So usually what happens is it requires the initial person or small group of people to either be so committed to their cause, right? To believe so much in the alternative that they're willing to risk their life. And that does happen, right, with activists, or the situation is just so bad. And like, let's say like even like the French Revolution. I mean, like until it gets bad enough that you're like, no, I don't even care if I lose the thing I have. It's just terrible. Most people aren't going to say anything. It's just not worth it. So usually it takes a combination of an initial catalyst who's got either nothing to lose or such deep commitment to the alternative, combined with a deterioration enough in the situation where people are kind of frustrated. So it's not enough that they don't believe, it's that they feel that they're not being treated right. When that happens, then usually you will end up dragging Mussolini off, right? And then usually these kind of things, as you noted in the examples, when they break quick. It'll take a while, and then suddenly it's like, wow, we just dragged Mussolini off like overnight. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia is an anomaly in history and has puzzled historians for quite a while because it's the only time when an authoritarian communist regime has been overthrown without a shot being fired, without anybody losing their life. So what's interesting about how that happened is, first of all, Václav Havel was a poet and a playwright, not a military person, not even a politician at the time. How this all plays out is, for a long time, people just assumed that the Czech people believed in communism, because if you looked around, everyone seemed to be going along with it. And so if that's true, good luck changing it, right? People must really want it. But as a playwright, he wrote this satire of communism called The Garden Party. It was so subtle that the censors didn't even know they were being made fun of. It was that good. And he puts it on and it becomes a runaway success, like the Hamilton of its time here in the States. Like everybody's talking about it. And he said people laughed at all the right parts. Like they laughed at things that you wouldn't find funny if you really believed in communism. And I think it's instructive for us today. If the problem is that we all just believe that we all believe, but no one really does, then the only way we're going to solve this is if we get people to stop living in a lie and get comfortable living in the truth again.
근데 또 집단 착각이 재밌는 게 이 책에 의하면 무너질 땐 되게 쉽게 무너진대요. 모든 사람들이 거짓말을 하고 있어야만 집단 착각이 유지가 되기 때문에 어느 순간에 지금 체제에 대해서 나만 불만이 있는 게 아니라 저 사람도 불만 있고 저 사람도 불만 있고 저 사람도 또 불만 있네. 이거를 서로 알게 되는 순간 그냥 와르르르 무너져 버린다고 합니다. 대표적으로 이제 이 책에 나오는 예가 체코 공산 독재가 어떻게 무너졌는지에 대한 얘기가 있는데, 바츠클라브 하벨이라고 하는 공산주의에 대한 굉장히 미묘한 패러디 연극을 쓴 사람이 있는데, 만약에 사람들이 공산주의에 불만이 없다면 그 연극을 보고 웃기지 않을 농담을 넣어놨대요. 근데 그 농담에서 모든 사람이 빵빵 터지는 걸 경험한 체코 국민들이 나만 이게 말도 안 된다고 생각하는 게 아니라 모두가 말도 안 된다고 생각하고 있구나라는 거를 깨닫고 갑자기 공산 정부에 복종을 하지 않기 시작하면서 순식간에 체코슬로바키아의 공산주의가 끝나버렸다라는 얘기를 하면서 사실 어떻게 보면은 우리가 가지고 있는 문제가 실질적인 문제일 때 아니면 사람의 잘못된 인식에서 비롯됐을 때는 그 인식을 고쳐나가야 되고 문제를 풀어야 되기 때문에 굉장히 어렵지만 어떤 문제는 단지 우리가 상대편의 의중을 잘 몰라가지고 서로 같이 거짓말을 하고 있는 상황에서 진실을 말하면 끝나는 문제이기 때문에 그런 경우에는 굉장히 쉽게 해결된다라는 희망적인 얘기도 했어요.
What's more shocking is that a lot of the people who live through dictatorships or, traumatic historic experiences go the other way and say those were actually the good times. Like they glorify these experiences. And I was wondering whether it has anything to do with one of the research that you wrote about in your book.
I always thought that was interesting on the Asch conformity studies with the line. It's one of the most famous conformity studies ever because it's so simple and kind of shocking, which is basically they recruit a bunch of undergrads to come in for what they think is a psychology perception experiment where you're just going to judge the length of lines. So in the regular kind of studies, and they've done a bunch of variations, you'd be shown a line, and let's say it's like 3 inches long, and then you'd be shown 3 or 4 other lines. Which one of these, A, B, C, D line is the same as the original line? And it's pretty obvious, right? Like twice as long, half as long. It's not very hard to tell what the right answer is. If you just give it to them one-on-one, they get 100% of the questions correct. But the clever thing that Asch did was, let's bring in a person, but put them in a room with other people who are in on the experiment. So they're Confederates. They know what's going on. So let's say you're sitting in a room with like 6 other people, and you're like the last person who gets to answer. They show the picture. Let's say line A is the right answer. But then sometimes everybody before you will say the wrong answer. So what will you do? You know it's not true, but like everyone's saying something different. The funny thing was it was pretty shocking how often people would just say whatever the group said. That was the standard one where you're like, okay, wow, people will just lie to be with the group. But then Asch interviewed everybody afterwards, every time they participated. And the thing that he was really puzzled by was that a good chunk of the people who had lied, some of them owned up to it right off the bat. They're like, yeah, I lied. I didn't want to go against the group. But some of them were like, what do you mean? That's exactly it. They were right. We were right. Like they really believed it. And Asch was like, that can't be true. So a colleague of mine in Atlanta followed up on Asch because Asch was in like the 50s, right? More recently using fMRI and did a version of that study. And what he found was pretty shocking that when people conformed, it was shaping the visual areas of their brain. It was actually changing what they saw.
Wow.
So they really did see what the group told them to see, which is pretty mind-boggling, right? That groups can affect not just our after-the-fact adjustment of our memory, but literally what we are seeing and therefore what memories we would store.
What was interesting in your book was that desire you said about to be honest with people. That whenever you lie or whenever you are going along with a flow that you don't really agree with, there's anxiety caused and there's it's actually detrimental to your physical well-being.
That was shocking to me too. And since the book came out, there's additional research on this. So when you are either self-silencing, just not saying something you know you should, or lying about what you think, what happens is that discrepancy inside creates a sort of cognitive dissonance, right? Like you just know it's not true and you're living a lie, whether that's by not saying anything or saying something you don't believe. And what it looks like happens is under that dissonance, it elevates a stress response. And so it increases cortisol all through your body, including in your blood vessels, which are actually, cortisol is quite bad. It breaks down blood vessels over time. It's meant to be a response to an immediate threat. It's not meant to be a lifelong, elevated thing. So what it looks like is the self-silencing creates an ongoing stress response. And we know that under that state, the rates of cardiovascular problems are actually significantly higher. So just from the standpoint of your own health and longevity, it's worth it to work at what we would call being more congruent.
결국 집단 착각에서 벗어나기 위해서 가장 강력한 우리가 가지고 있는 무기는 자신감이라는 얘기를 해요. 자기 인생에 가는 방향이라든지 자기가 어떤 생각을 해야 되는지 여러 책을 읽고 많은 생각을 해서 확고한 믿음을 가지고 있는 사람은 남의 눈치를 안 보지만 자기의 인생에 대한 자신감이 떨어져 있는 사람은 남의 눈치를 볼 수밖에 없다라는 얘기를 합니다.
You know, in the book, the way I was thinking about self-confidence is the kind of self-confidence we know that comes off of being congruent, which is just consistently being true to myself, that authenticity, and then true about myself to other people, which would be sincerity. That consistency we know leads to healthy self-confidence. By feeling more self-confident, it helps inoculate you against group pressure to go against who you are. So then congruence becomes easier to do. So it's a nice flywheel that way.
Yeah, I guess having listened to you explain it, it's actually fairly obvious. Let's just say, I go to a French fine dining restaurant for the first time in my life, and I have no idea how to use the fork and the knife. The only cue that I have to go by is other people's gaze, right? So what I'll do is I'll pick up one fork, and if people are kind of going like this, I'm like, oh, maybe I picked up the wrong fork, and I'll be extremely sensitive of how other people are looking at me. But if, let's say, I'm a food expert, and I think I know more about the tradition of French dining than people sitting around me, I probably won't necessarily look at how other people look at me, right?
It wouldn't even matter. You feel very confident. It's a great example.
And also the fact that most people who are not versed in, fine dining, hate fine dining, is testament to the fact of what you write in your book, that most people do not like going by other people's judgment, right?
또 한편으로 SNS라는 것이 우리의 불안감을 고조시키도록 디자인되어 있는 프로그램이다라는 얘기를 해요. 다시 말하면 우리가 자신감을 가지고 싶어도 소셜미디어라는 환경 때문에 자신감이 점점 깎여 내려갈 수밖에 없다는 거죠. 그렇다면 우리가 SNS를 다 끊을 수도 없는 일이고, 이 SNS처럼 우리의 자신감을 계속 깎아내리는 것에 둘러싸여 있는 상황에서 어떻게 하면 자신감을 지켜내고 집단 착각에 빠지지 않을 수 있는지에 대해서 물어봤습니다.
I think three things that are important. So number one, at a personal level, recognizing whatever you think your group thinks, you're probably wrong. This fear that I have to change my views because my group disagrees with me, especially if it's an online group, it's probably an illusion. How would you ask yourself, would I really conform if I thought this wasn't what the group thinks? So at least give yourself the sense of just remind yourself you are probably wrong about what you're thinking right now. And so just make sure you don't just automatically conform. But there's a couple of things that socially that you can do that make a really big difference. Okay. So first is what you'll realize pretty quickly is online. We tend to think we're getting a broad range of groups, but actually we tend to get echo chambers really quick. We're only following certain people on social media. We're hearing from a very small group. So it turns out that even exposing yourself to a wider range of ideas and groups, even groups you don't like very much, that sort of pluralism is really important because there's no such thing as conformity if you think that there's a bunch of different opinions. And so it's only when it starts to feel like everybody agrees that you will feel pulled to conformity. So an easy answer is make sure you have diversified the groups that you are hearing from. But the other thing, and this will seem a little old-fashioned, but it's really important, online groups are the easiest to manipulate. They are also the least rewarding socially. What's interesting is the power of groups in real life, the power of getting out and actually hanging out with friends in smaller groups is probably the most important thing you can do. Because it's way more likely if there's 4 or 5 of us and we're hanging out, and I start talking, I'm more likely to tell you what I think because it's just a few of us. And then you quickly realize a lot of the stuff that you're thinking we all agree, we don't really agree. So that combination of recognizing that this idea of collective illusions and just making sure, are you sure this is really what the group thinks before you conform? Diversifying the inputs you're getting online so that you don't get an echo chamber. And then trying to create a balance where you are actually putting time in real life with people that matter.
많은 사람들이 인터넷 상에 있을 때 자기가 가장 자기의 모습대로 살 수 없다고 느끼는 경우가 많은 것 같아요. 인스타그램에 뭘 올리면은 완벽한 모습만 올려야 되고, 페이스북에다가 긴 글을 올릴 때도 굉장히 있어 보이는 글만 올려야 된다고 생각하고, 아니면은 자기의 정치적인 신념이라든지 세상이 돌아가는 거에 대한 생각을 올리려고 하다가도 사람들이 와가지고 나한테 악플 달면 어떡하지? 라고 하면서 스스로의 말을 검열하게 되는 그런 세계가 됐다고 많은 사람들이 느끼고 있는 것 같습니다. 토드 로즈의 집단 착각이라는 책은 이런 시대를 살아가는 우리한테 굉장히 깊은 경고를 주고 있는 것 같아요. 우리가 이렇게 남의 눈치를 보고 서로 할 말을 못하게 하는 사회를 만들게 됐을 때 그 결말이 어디까지 갈 수 있는지, 그리고 그런 결말에 가지 않기 위해서 우리 사회가 어떻게 변해야 되고, 그리고 우리 자신은 어떻게 행동해야 되는지에 대해서 많은 지혜를 담고 있는 책이라서 오늘 소개해봤습니다. 오늘 조승현의 탐구생활은 여기서 마무리하고요. 다음번엔 더 재밌는 역사 문화 이야기로 여러분 찾아뵐게요. 안녕히 계십시오.
Thank you very much for this insightful conversation. After reading Dark Horse and End of Average, can I write you again and maybe talk about your other books as well?
Absolutely. I would love it.
Thank you for your insight and thank you for this great book.
No, thank you. It was great talking to you.
Have a great
See ya.
day. Bye.
Bye.